Right now, something bigger than politics is unfolding, and for the first time, Donald Trump's strategy toward Canada may be breaking down in real time. At this moment, the entire conversation around Donald Trump's strategy toward Canada may be changing faster than almost anyone expected. And if you've been watching the story only from the surface, let me tell you something. You are missing the real shift. Not the headline, not the rhetoric, the shift underneath it. Because what appears to be unfolding right now is not just another cross-border political spat, not just another trade threat, not just another cycle of nationalist posturing. It looks much bigger than that. It looks like a test of whether old pressure tactics still work in a world that is learning in real time how to resist them. And that is why I need you to understand the weight of what I'm about to say. If this interpretation is correct, then Trump's Canada strategy is not merely under pressure, it is not merely wobbling, it may be falling apart in full public view, because Mark Carney, or at least the political and economic logic now associated with him, has changed the rules of the game overnight. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the next few days and weeks could determine whether this becomes a contained political fight or the beginning of something much more historic, much more seismic, and much more permanent. Let's rewind the clock and trace how we got here. For a long time, the basic assumption behind Trump-style international pressure was simple: find the leverage, raise the costs, force the weaker party to blink. It is a strategy built on asymmetry, on spectacle, on the belief that size alone can create obedience: bigger market, bigger military footprint, bigger threat. And for a while, that strategy often looked effective, at least on television. It created fear, it created confusion, it created a countdown. And in politics, sometimes confusion itself becomes a weapon. But here's what most people don't understand. A strategy like that only works if the target accepts the frame, if the target believes the game is still being played on the old board, under the old rules, with the old vulnerabilities. The moment the target decides to reprice the risk, rewire the alliance structure, recalibrate the financial exposure, and turn what looked like weakness into strategic resilience, the whole mechanism starts to jam, quickly, mechanically, sometimes irreversibly. That may be what we are watching now. Trump's approach to Canada, whether expressed through tariffs, threats, political pressure, public insults, or pressure campaigns designed to extract concessions, depends on an image of Canada as the junior partner that ultimately has no choice but to come back to the table on Washington's terms. It depends on the idea that the United States can absorb the pain more easily than Canada. It depends on the assumption that Canada's business class, political establishments, and public opinion will fracture under pressure. It depends above all on the belief that when the temperature rises, Ottawa will fold. But what if Ottawa doesn't fold? What if the answer is not panic, not retreat, not theatrical outrage, but disciplined counterpositioning? That is where Carney changes the picture. Now, before I go further, let me be precise. This is not about treating one man like a magician. This is not hero worship. This is not mythology. This is about understanding what Carney represents in the eyes of markets, institutions, central bankers, global investors, technocrats, and political operators on both sides of the border. He represents fluency in systems. He represents credibility under stress. He represents the language of capital, risk, and international coordination. And when a confrontation moves out of the realm of pure political theater and into the realm of financial credibility, supply chain durability, investor confidence, currency stability, and alliance architecture, that is exactly the kind of figure who can change the rules overnight. Think about that. Trump's greatest advantage has always been forcing opponents into his preferred arena: speed, dominance, headline warfare, emotional intensity, maximum pressure. But Carney's greatest potential advantage is the opposite: slow the tempo, change the metrics, shift the battlefield from slogans to consequences, move the fight from cable news to capital flows, from applause lines to borrowing costs, from nationalist adrenaline to institutional endurance. And once that happens, the person shouting the loudest may no longer be the person controlling the outcome. Hit that like button if this is making sense so far, because this is where it gets serious. Let me tell you something about political power in the modern world. It is never just political. It is financial, it is psychological, it is diplomatic, it is logistical, it is informational. And when one side is still fighting as though brute pressure is enough, while the other side starts building a layered defense across all 5 of those dimensions, the countdown begins. Not always for the defender, sometimes for the aggressor. Here's what that looks like in plain language. If Canada can convince markets that it has a credible long-game response, then the cost of threatening Canada rises. If Canada can signal to allies that this is about more than one bilateral dispute, then the diplomatic price rises. If Canadian leaders can convince domestic audiences that temporary pain now prevents permanent subordination later, then the political cost of resistance falls. If business leaders begin pricing in uncertainty around Trump's strategy rather than simply assuming Canada will capitulate, then the leverage starts to migrate. Read that again. The leverage starts to migrate. That is the whole story. And this is why Carney matters, even beyond any specific office or statement. He embodies the kind of calm, system-literate, internationally legible response that can turn a pressure campaign into a self-inflicted wound. Because once markets suspect that a threat will not produce a quick concession, they begin asking a different question. Not how much can Trump force, but how much instability will this create? And when that question starts circulating in boardrooms, ministries, pension funds, sovereign desks, export councils, and currency markets, the strategy itself begins to weaken. Nobody saw this coming because too many people were still trapped in the old script. The old script said Canada is exposed. The old script said Washington escalates and Ottawa adjusts. The old script said nationalist pressure always dominates technocratic caution because one is loud and the other is boring. But boring institutions, when they lock in, can be devastating. Quiet competence can be explosive. Credibility can be a weapon. And the more Trump relies on public pressure, the more vulnerable he becomes if his target starts winning in private systems that voters don't always see immediately, but absolutely feel later through prices, jobs, investment, and confidence. Now, let's talk about the characters in this drama, because personalities matter here. Donald Trump is many things at once: a political performer, a nationalist strategist, a brand operator, a pressure negotiator, and a man who instinctively believes that asymmetry is destiny. This is a person who has spent years proving that in politics, raw force, repetition, and media dominance can overwhelm slower-moving institutions. He thrives on compression. He thrives on confrontation. He thrives when the other side looks hesitant, divided, or frightened. And here's what most people don't understand about Trump. He often treats unpredictability not as a liability, but as an asset. He wants counterparts off balance. He wants elites uncertain. He wants markets nervous enough to listen, but not always broken enough to revolt. That balance is delicate. When it works, it looks formidable. When it fails, it can look catastrophic. Mark Carney, by contrast, projects something very different. He is associated with central banking, crisis management, financial signaling, and elite institutional trust. Publicly, that can make him seem less combustible, less exciting, even less politically cinematic. But strategically, it gives him a different kind of force. This is a person shaped by systems under stress, a person comfortable in rooms where a single word can move billions, a person who understands that confidence is not abstract. Confidence determines whether money stays, whether prices hold, whether allies commit, whether business delays, whether panic spreads. His power, or the power of the model he represents, is not in dominating the camera. It is in redefining the incentives behind the camera, and that is a dangerous opponent for Trump-style pressure, because when these two logics collide, spectacle versus stability, coercion versus credibility, volatility versus institutional fluency, something has to give. The question is not whether there will be consequences, but when, and once those consequences start arriving, they do not remain contained. They spread, they compound, they reshape behavior. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. Here's the first major implication. If you live in Canada, this is not just about elite strategy. This is about your cost of living, your mortgage sensitivity, your job security, your export exposure, your retirement savings, and the long-term pricing of sovereignty itself. If you work in manufacturing, energy, logistics, agriculture, banking, retail, or trade-facing services, you are already inside the blast radius of any serious US-Canada confrontation. If you run a small business, you may not care about diplomatic theory, but you will care about input costs, currency moves, freight delays, and consumer confidence. If you have a pension, you will care whether markets begin treating this as a passing shock or a structural repricing. And if you live in the United States, don't think you're outside the story either, because this is not a one-sided cost. It never was. Integrated supply chains do not respect political slogans. Cross-border trade does not vanish without collateral damage. Energy flows, auto parts, commodities, food systems, shipping lanes, labor linkages, investment exposure, and regional employment networks are all entangled. That means a strategy designed to punish Canada circle back and punish American producers, American consumers, American workers, and American states, especially border states, especially trade-heavy sectors, especially industries already stretched by inflation, uncertainty, and geopolitical fragmentation. This is not theory. This is how interconnected systems behave under stress. When one node is hit, the shock travels. When the shock travels, pricing changes. When pricing changes, politics follows. When politics follows, the original strategy starts facing pressure from its own supposed beneficiaries. That is the domino chain.
That is the hidden mechanism, and that is why what looks like strength in a rally speech can become weakness in an earnings call, weakness in a procurement review, weakness in an agricultural contract, weakness in a governor's office, weakness in a voter's kitchen. Here's the kicker. Carney's real move, if that is indeed the move underway, is not simply to oppose Trump. It is to change the cost structure of opposing him. That is a far more sophisticated play. It means reframing the dispute from Canada can endure pressure to can Trump sustain the consequences of failed pressure. Those are not the same question, not even close. One assumes Canadian vulnerability. The other tests American endurance, business patience, and market tolerance for disruption. Do you understand how stunning that is? Because if that reframing holds, then Trump is no longer the only actor setting the tempo. He becomes one participant in a larger system that starts sending signals back, and systems can be unforgiving. Markets don't care about ego, supply chains don't care about applause, currency traders don't care about patriotic branding.
Lenders don't care about rhetoric if the numbers deteriorate. Investors don't care who sounded toughest if the risk premium jumps. That is where the strategy can start to collapse, not with a bang at first, with a spread, with hesitation, with repricing, with delayed decisions, with boardroom caution, with quiet phone calls, with pressure from allies, with domestic backlash from constituencies that were never supposed to feel the pain this fast. Then, suddenly, what looked controlled starts looking unstable. What looked tactical starts looking impulsive. What looked dominant starts looking trapped by its own escalation ladder. Smash that like button if this blows your mind, because the most explosive part is coming next. Beyond the trade and political mechanics, there's something deeper happening here. This isn't just about Trump. This isn't just about Canada. This is about whether middle powers, allied states, and institutional actors have finally learned how to survive the age of pressure politics. That's the real story. The architecture of coercion only works if enough people believe resistance is futile. The moment a credible countermodel emerges, not perfect, not painless, but workable, the entire global conversation changes. A blueprint appears. And once a blueprint appears, other countries study it. That is why this moment feels bigger than a bilateral dispute. If Canada shows that disciplined economic statecraft, credible financial signaling, allied coordination, and public resilience can blunt raw pressure, then every country watching takes notes. Europe takes notes. Asian allies take notes. Latin American governments take notes. Market actors take notes. Future governments in Washington take notes. Future challengers to Washington take notes. The lesson spreads, not with tanks, with memos, not with speeches, with spreadsheets, not with ideology, with incentives. That is how systems change. And there is a moral dimension to this too, because at the heart of this conflict is a fundamental question. What kind of international order survives the next decade? One organized around impulsive domination and threat escalation, or one in which credibility, trust, durability, and mutual dependence still have some restraining force? I'm not naive. Power matters, hard power matters, economic power matters, but the moral authority of any system begins to crack when force becomes the first answer to every disagreement. When that happens, allies stop feeling like allies, they start feeling like hostages, and hostages eventually look for exits. So where does this end? I see two paths and no middle ground. Path 1 is difficult, disciplined, and still possible. Cooler heads recognize the danger. Trump's camp realizes that pressure without fast capitulation creates compounding costs. Canadian leadership maintains internal unity and avoids theatrical overreach. Business leaders on both sides of the border push for stabilization before temporary disruption becomes permanent fragmentation. Allies quietly reinforce the message that escalation is expensive and strategically self-defeating. Markets reward de-escalation. Supply chains normalize. Political leaders claim partial victory and retreat from the edge. This is the hopeful path. It requires Trump-style politics to accept limits, and it requires Canada's establishment to withstand pain without panicking. That is a lot to ask. Path 2 is darker, far darker. Threats intensify, countermeasures expand, business confidence weakens, border industries begin taking visible hits, consumers feel higher costs, political media ecosystems radicalize the conflict. Each side becomes more locked into its own narrative. Diplomacy shrinks, retaliation becomes normalized. Investors begin assuming more instability, not less. What started as leverage becomes a cycle. What started as a tactic becomes a doctrine. Then the doctrine spreads beyond Canada. Other allies recalculate. Other relationships fray. The damage becomes permanent. Nobody wins. Everyone bleeds. And the old assumption that North American integration is too valuable to seriously rupture begins to die. I think we are closer to the second path than many people want to admit, but I also know moments like this can turn fast. Here's what I know for certain. The relationship will never feel the same after this, even if there is a negotiated cooling-off period tomorrow. Because once a country realizes it may have to build defenses not only against adversaries, but against the strategic volatility of its closest partner, trust is shattered. Maybe not publicly, maybe not all at once, but internally, structurally, permanently. You can't unring that bell. And Carney, whether his actor, symbol, or strategic template, didn't just challenge a pressure campaign. He may have shown the world a blueprint for how a smaller but highly institutionalized country can fight back against a larger power without mirroring its chaos. A blueprint built on credibility, discipline, market fluency, and alliance signaling that matters maybe more than people realize right now. The question now is whether Washington learns the lesson or doubles down on the mistake. The question is whether Canada can sustain the kind of unity required to make this work. The question is whether markets remain patient, whether voters remain calm, whether business leaders remain rational, and whether political incentives remain survivable. I'm not optimistic, but I've been wrong before. So, what do you think? Is Carney saving Canada's strategic position or gambling with it? Is Trump still holding the stronger hand, or has the table itself changed? And the biggest question of all, are we watching a temporary rupture or the beginning of a permanent redesign of how allied countries deal with American pressure in the 21st century? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this story could move immediately, and the next round of signals, reactions, and consequences may arrive faster than people expect. This story isn't slowing down. Don't look away.